Imagine standing at the shore, watching waves carry whispers of countless stories that shaped a land. Each ripple reveals the triumphs and trials of explorers, dreamers, and those who dared to seek new beginnings. The United States is a tapestry woven from the threads of indigenous cultures, courageous immigrants, and revolutionary thinkers. Their combined tales formed the roots of a powerful nation, but those roots were nurtured by both unity and conflict, vision and sacrifice. In this documentary, we will follow the winding path from ancient civilizations to modern times. We will see how the aspirations of many became the promises of a nation, observe how innovation changed daily life, and witness the struggles that tested the very fabric of society. Our journey spans centuries of discovery and transformation, a mosaic of people, ideas, and events that continue to influence the world today. Join me as we explore every step of this remarkable adventure. This is the entire history of the United States of America. Long before European ships reached the eastern shores of North America, diverse indigenous peoples thrived across the continent. Many scholars believe that the earliest inhabitants arrived thousands of years ago by crossing a land bridge from Asia into what is now Alaska. Over time, they migrated outward, adapting to new lands and developing rich cultural traditions. Some groups built large earthwork mounds for ceremonial and residential purposes, such as those we see in present-day Ohio or Mississippi. Others constructed sophisticated cliff dwellings in the desert Southwest. The ancestral Puebloans, also referred to as the Anasazi, left behind striking structures in places like Mesa Verde. These varied peoples spoke distinct languages, followed different customs, and organized themselves into numerous tribal nations, including the Powhatan, Iroquois, Cherokee, Pueblo, Navajo, and countless others. Each group shaped the environment in unique ways, practicing hunting, gathering, and agriculture by planting crops like corn, beans, and squash. They held deep spiritual connections to the natural world, maintaining social and political systems grounded in shared responsibility. For centuries, they traded goods among themselves, engaged in local conflicts, and formed alliances that lasted generations. When European explorers arrived from across the Atlantic, they encountered societies that already had complex histories. Christopher Columbus's voyage in 1492 often symbolizes the first lasting contact between Europeans and the Americas, though Norse explorers like Leif Erikson had likely visited parts of the continent around the year 1000. Following Columbus's journeys, Spain claimed large sections of both North and South America. Spanish expeditions were motivated by a desire for new trade routes, land acquisition, and the hope of discovering gold or other precious resources. Explorers such as Juan Ponce de Leon landed in what is now Florida in 1513, while Hernando de Soto traveled through the southeastern regions of what would eventually become the United States. The oldest continuously occupied European-founded city in the United States, St. Augustine, was established by the Spanish in Florida in 1565. French explorers like Jacques Cartier and Samuel de Champlain navigated the St. Lawrence River in pursuit of wealth and trading opportunities, eventually founding settlements in what is now Canada. The French also ventured southward, setting up trading posts where they interacted with Native American communities, exchanging iron tools, beads, and other goods for furs and additional resources. English interest in North America gained momentum toward the end of the 16th century. Although John Cabot's voyage in 1497 gave England an early claim to parts of the continent, it was not until the late 1500s that renewed attempts at colonizing took root. Sir Walter Raleigh sponsored settlements on Roanoke Island, off the coast of what is now North Carolina, but these efforts failed. One early group disappeared under mysterious circumstances, eventually earning the nickname the Lost Colony. Still determined to stake a claim, England recognized the economic and strategic potential of the New World and looked to establish a more permanent presence. In 1607, the Virginia Company financed the voyage of about 100 settlers to the banks of the James River, leading to the foundation of Jamestown in what is now Virginia. Life there was extremely difficult at first. Many colonists succumbed to disease, hunger, and conflicts with the local Powhatan Confederacy. Over time, they learned to adapt by growing tobacco, which became an influential cash crop that drew further investment and a steady supply of newcomers. In 1620, a different group of English people, known as the Pilgrims, arrived aboard the Mayflower. They landed in what is now Massachusetts, seeking religious freedom and a chance to preserve their own customs. This new settlement at Plymouth faced its own hardships, but cooperation with local Wampanoag people helped the Pilgrims survive. By 1630, another wave of English Puritans joined them in the region, founding the Massachusetts Bay Colony. These settlers had deeply religious motivations and established communities governed by their faith. Throughout the early 17th century, trade, agricultural practices, and increasing immigration expanded the number of European colonies. Over time, these settlements grew and diversified, bringing together different religious beliefs, economic setups, and social structures. Each colony developed governments and traditions that set them on parallel, yet distinct paths. This period marks the convergence of many worlds. Native communities continued to maintain their own traditions, though European diseases and encroachment took a toll. Europeans arrived with new technology and ambitions, sometimes cooperating with indigenous peoples and at other times battling them for resources and land. These early exchanges, alliances, and conflicts formed the basis for what would become the United States. By the mid-1600s, English, French, Spanish, and Dutch colonies dotted the Atlantic coastline and inland trade routes. Over the decades, their fortunes would rise, fall, and merge, laying the foundations for the social complexity we see in the centuries that followed. Following the initial struggles of Jamestown and other early settlements, England's presence in North America strengthened. By the late 17th century, multiple colonies had emerged along the Atlantic seaboard. These included Virginia, Massachusetts, New York, Maryland, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Hampshire, Delaware, North Carolina, South Carolina, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Georgia. Over time, these territories came to be known as the 13 colonies, each with its own distinct environment, economy, and social structure. Scholars often categorize them into three broad regions: New England, the Middle Colonies, and the Southern Colonies. The New England colonies, which included Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New Hampshire, tended to have rockier soil and a cooler climate, making large-scale agriculture difficult. Instead, families practiced subsistence farming on smaller parcels of land. Many colonists turned to industries like shipbuilding, fishing, and trade, benefiting from the Atlantic Ocean and good natural harbors. Strong religious influence, especially from Puritan beliefs, shaped community life. Town meetings and a focus on moral discipline formed a foundation for local governance, which encouraged communal decision-making. Meanwhile, the Middle Colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, often featured fertile soil and balanced climates that supported diverse crops, including wheat and other grains. These colonies attracted immigrants from various parts of Europe, such as the Netherlands, Germany, and Sweden. As a result, the Middle Colonies developed a more pluralistic culture, where different religious and ethnic communities coexisted. Philadelphia and New York City began to grow into bustling centers of commerce, offering more urban opportunities than some of their neighbors in New England or the South. The Southern Colonies, Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, took advantage of richer soils and a warmer climate suitable for cash crops like tobacco, rice, and later cotton. Large plantations became a foundation of the Southern economy, particularly in coastal areas and river valleys. Early on, planters used indentured servants who worked a set number of years in exchange for passage to North America. Over time, though, the slave trade became central to Southern agriculture. Enslaved Africans were forced to perform unpaid labor, creating a system that shaped the region's economy and social hierarchy. Even smaller farmers and backcountry settlers, who often did not own large tracts of land, were influenced by this broader agricultural environment. A growing population and an emerging sense of shared interests gradually linked these colonies, often leading to cooperation but sometimes resulting in conflicts. Many colonists began to view themselves as subjects who deserved the rights and protections extended to Englishmen back in Europe. At the same time, British authorities imposed mercantilist policies, believing the colonies existed to strengthen the mother country's economy. Laws like the Navigation Acts restricted trade to English or colonial ships, limiting who the colonists could sell to and buy from. While this fed resentment in some quarters, many colonists remained loyal, believing that Britain provided them protection and a stable market. During the mid-18th century, North America became the stage for a wider global conflict between European powers. The French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, pitted British forces and colonial militias against the French and their indigenous allies. This war was part of the larger Seven Years' War. Although Britain ultimately prevailed, the conflict drained the treasury, prompting the British government to look for ways to raise revenue. Colonists, however, were frustrated. They had fought alongside British troops, yet soon found themselves taxed without a direct voice in Parliament. British authorities introduced measures like the Sugar Act of 1764 and the Stamp Act of 1765, which required colonists to pay taxes on legal documents, newspapers, and other paper products. These acts sparked protests, boycotts, and the rallying cry of "no taxation without representation." Groups such as the Sons of Liberty emerged, organizing demonstrations against British policies. When Britain repealed the Stamp Act, but passed new taxes under the Townshend Acts of 1767, tensions grew further. Episodes like the Boston Massacre in 1770, where British soldiers killed several colonists during a confrontation, came to symbolize mounting anger on both sides. The situation escalated when colonists, disguised as Mohawk warriors, boarded ships in Boston Harbor in December 1773 and threw chests of British tea overboard. This event, known as the Boston Tea Party, was a protest against perceived unfair taxation. In response, the British government enacted the Coercive Acts, also called the Intolerable Acts, to punish Massachusetts. These measures closed Boston Harbor and curtailed local governance. Outrage spread among the colonies, encouraging leaders to convene what became the First Continental Congress in 1774, where delegates planned collective actions and petitioned the Crown for relief. Despite the wish of many colonists to remain part of the British Empire, a shared sense of injustice and a desire for autonomy began to take hold. Leaders like Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, and John Adams pushed for stronger resistance, believing that the colonies had a right to govern themselves. Still, the transition from protest to outright rebellion was not immediate. Many colonists held moderate positions, hoping for reconciliation. Over time, violent encounters and the refusal of British authorities to allow colonial input on governance left many Americans feeling that an independent path might be the only solution. By the mid-1770s, a series of political, economic, and social pressures had woven together, creating the sentiment that the colonies would not be able to preserve their rights and dignity under continued British rule. The next step would be open conflict, prompted by skirmishes at Lexington and Concord in 1775. This move toward a complete break would culminate in a formal declaration and a new sense of destiny for the people of these colonies. Their struggle against a powerful empire was about to begin. By the spring of 1775, tensions between Britain and its American colonies had reached a breaking point. Early on April 19th, shots were fired at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts, sparking the first armed conflict of what would become the American Revolution. Colonial militias, made up of ordinary citizens, confronted British troops who sought to seize weapons stored in local towns. These brief but significant clashes demonstrated that the colonial resolve to protect their rights was strong, and they inspired wider support for armed resistance against British authorities. In June 1775, colonial forces clashed with the British near Boston in the Battle of Bunker Hill. Although the British technically won the battle, They suffered heavy losses, and the confrontation boosted the morale of the colonists. Around this time, the Continental Congress, representing the colonies, chose George Washington, a respected Virginian with military experience, to lead the newly formed Continental Army. Washington's leadership became a unifying force as colonists from different regions realized that cooperation would be key to their success. Despite these early conflicts, many colonists still hoped for peace. However, the situation changed when Britain refused to address colonial grievances. Influential pamphlets like Thomas Paine's Common Sense argued that the colonies not only had the right to break from British rule, but also the responsibility to do so in order to build a more just government. Gradually, public opinion shifted. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, which declared the colonies free from British rule and spelled out key principles such as the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Once the declaration was announced, the colonies faced the challenge of backing up their words with military action. The British Army was well-trained and had an established navy. The Continental Army, meanwhile, struggled with limited resources, harsh winters, and uncertain funding. Early setbacks included the loss of New York City in 1776, forcing Washington to retreat and regroup. However, strategic moves such as the surprise crossing of the Delaware River on Christmas night of 1776, which led to an American victory at Trenton, helped restore confidence. The turning point in the war came in 1777 with the Battle of Saratoga. American forces, overseen by Generals Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold, defeated a significant British army in upstate New York. This success convinced France that the Americans had a real chance of winning the war. Determined to weaken its old rival, France recognized American independence and entered the war as an ally to the colonies in 1778. Spanish and Dutch assistance would follow, making the conflict a global struggle. As the war ground on, fighting shifted to the southern colonies, where both sides tried to win the support of local communities. In 1781, American and French forces trapped a major British army led by General Cornwallis in Yorktown, Virginia. Cornwallis had little hope of escape or resupply, and he surrendered on October 19, 1781. Though smaller skirmishes continued afterward, Yorktown effectively ended major combat in North America. 2 years later, the Treaty of Paris, 1783, made the independence of the United States official and set its boundaries, granting the new nation significant territory stretching to the Mississippi River. Having achieved independence, the former colonies now faced the task of forming a lasting government. The first national framework, the Articles of Confederation, gave most powers to individual states. It soon became clear that this system made it hard to raise funds, settle disputes, and conduct foreign affairs effectively. Some states quarreled over borders and trade policies. Shays' Rebellion in 1786 to 1787, an uprising of farmers who were burdened by debt in Massachusetts, underlined the weaknesses of the national government under the Articles. Realizing the need for a stronger central authority, delegates from 12 states gathered in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 for the Constitutional Convention. Although their initial goal was to revise the Articles of Confederation, they instead chose to create an entirely new framework, the United States Constitution. This document established a federal system with 3 branches of government: executive, legislative, and judicial, each balancing the powers of the others. After extensive debate and compromise, the final draft was signed on September 17, 1787, but it still needed the approval of the states. Concerns arose about the potential for the new central government to overpower individual liberties. To address this, supporters of the Constitution, Federalists, promised to add a Bill of Rights safeguarding freedoms such as speech, religion, and assembly. The Constitution took effect in 1788, once the required majority of states had ratified it. George Washington became the first president of the United States under this new system in 1789. In 1791, the Bill of Rights, 10 amendments protecting individual freedoms and limiting government power, was added, preserving the vital balance that many Americans saw as critical for their new republic. By the end of 1791, the Revolution was over, and the United States had a new constitution, a president, and a guiding set of legal protections. This period set the tone for debates about democracy, federal power, and individual rights, topics that would continue to shape the nation's politics and society for generations to come. At the close of the 18th century, the United States had secured its independence and created a new constitutional framework. Yet the country was still young, and its leaders and citizens faced many questions about how to shape their future. These challenges set the stage for the dramatic transformations that marked the 19th century, an era that saw a vast westward expansion, significant industrial growth, and increasing debates over political and social issues that tested the strength of the nation. Throughout the early 1800s, the population of the United States grew rapidly, and people looked toward the wide territories west of the Appalachian Mountains. One pivotal event was the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 under President Thomas Jefferson. The United States bought a massive tract of land from France, effectively doubling the nation's size and extending its boundaries from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. This momentous deal opened up opportunities for farmers, traders, and adventurers, all eager to see what the newly acquired territory held. Still, questions arose about how to govern this vast frontier, how to handle relations with Native American nations, and what role slavery would play in new states entering the Union. Around the same time, the young republic found itself embroiled in global conflicts. The War of 1812, fought between the United States and Great Britain, was rooted in issues such as trade restrictions and the forced conscription of American sailors into the British Navy. Though the United States struggled at first, with British forces even setting fire to the White House in 1814, the conflict ended in something of a stalemate with the Treaty of Ghent. Despite the lack of a clear military victory, many Americans felt a renewed sense of unity and national pride in the war's aftermath. Figures like Andrew Jackson, who achieved a major victory at the Battle of New Orleans, fought after the treaty was signed due to slow communication, rose to prominence as war heroes. During the presidency of James Monroe, the United States proclaimed the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. This policy declared that the Americas were no longer open to European colonization and that any European intervention in the region would be viewed as a threat to U.S. interests. Although the United States lacked the military might to enforce such a policy by itself at that stage, the pronouncement symbolized a growing confidence among American leaders. It also reflected a belief that the Western Hemisphere had its own destiny, separate from the centuries-old struggles and alliances of Europe. Economically, the early to mid-19th century saw significant advances driven by the roots of the Industrial Revolution. In the North, factories sprang up around growing urban centers. Textile mills, such as those in Lowell, Massachusetts, processed cotton shipped in from the South into finished cloth. Over time, inventors like Eli Whitney contributed to both industrial and agricultural change. Whitney's 1793 invention, the cotton gin, made it easier and faster to clean raw cotton, effectively fueling the growth of large-scale cotton plantations. This technological development further entrenched the use of enslaved labor in the southern states because the increased productivity made cotton even more profitable. Meanwhile, in northern factories, labor forces often consisted of young women, recent immigrants, and other groups seeking wages in rapidly expanding industrial hubs. As the country expanded westward, roads, canals, and eventually railroads connected distant regions more effectively. The Erie Canal, completed in 1825, linked the Great Lakes region to the Atlantic, fostering trade and settlement by providing a cheaper and more efficient way to move goods. This infrastructure growth tied the agricultural output of the Midwest to eastern cities and created a sense that progress and technology were linking all corners of the country together. Still, a gap between North and South began to surface. Northern states leaned more heavily toward industrialization and free labor, while the southern economy depended on plantation agriculture and enslaved workers. Political divides also grew sharper. Andrew Jackson's presidency, 1829 to 1837, ushered in what historians sometimes refer to as the Jacksonian era, marked by greater political participation from white men who did not own property. Jackson championed the idea that government should represent the common man, but his policies also relied on a forceful approach to territorial expansion. Under his administration, the Indian Removal Act of 1830 authorized the forced relocation of Native American communities living in the Southeast to lands west of the Mississippi River. The resulting Trail of Tears, which saw thousands of Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, and other nations forced from their ancestral lands, brought widespread suffering and death. This event remains one of the darkest chapters in American history, underscoring the ruthlessness with which many U.S. leaders treated indigenous peoples in their pursuit of new territory for white settlers. Continuing this westward momentum, American settlers established communities in Mexican-controlled regions like Texas during the 1820s and 1830s. Conflicts over cultural differences, governance, and the role of slavery led to tensions with Mexican authorities. In 1836, settlers declared independence for the Republic of Texas. Though Mexico did not officially recognize this independence, Texas functioned as a separate republic for nearly a decade. Eventually, it was annexed by the United States in 1845, adding to the growing geography of the nation. This annexation, coupled with a boundary dispute along the Rio Grande, contributed to the start of the Mexican-American War in 1846. The conflict ended in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, through which Mexico ceded to the United States a large swath of territory that now includes California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and parts of Colorado and New Mexico. This victory further fueled the national appetite for expansion, but intensified the debate over whether new territories should allow slavery. Rapid changes were not restricted to geopolitics alone. In 1848, gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill in California, igniting the famous California gold rush. Fortune seekers, known as 49ers, rushed west from across the United States, and even from overseas, to try their luck mining for gold. This migration caused a sudden surge in California's population, speeding its path to statehood. In 1850, California entered the Union as a free state under the Compromise of 1850, a legislative package intended to ease tensions by balancing the interests of free and slave states. The Compromise introduced a stricter fugitive slave law, making it easier for Southern slaveholders to recover escaped enslaved individuals, even in states where slavery was not permitted. This deepened divisions between anti-slavery and pro-slavery factions, creating moral and legal battles that loomed large on the national stage. During these years, the abolitionist movement in the North gathered momentum. Activists like Frederick Douglass, a former slave turned influential writer and speaker, and Harriet Tubman, who guided many enslaved individuals to freedom along the Underground Railroad, highlighted the evils of slavery. Religious and political groups joined calls to end the institution, while some Southern politicians defended it as essential to their economic survival. Writers like Harriet Beecher Stowe, whose 1852 novel Uncle Tom's Cabin vividly illustrated the cruelty of slavery, stirred public opinion. This polarization made compromise increasingly difficult, as each legislative fix, such as the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which attempted to maintain a balance between slave and free states, proved temporary. Within this climate of growing tension, the nation continued to modernize. The railroad network expanded significantly, drawing together distant sections of the country. As businesses grew and factories became more common, cities teemed with new arrivals in search of jobs. Immigration from Europe, especially from Ireland and Germany, added to the urban population during the mid-19th century. Many immigrants faced nativist resistance, including social discrimination and occasional violence from established communities who feared job competition or changes to local customs. Despite these challenges, the steady influx of new workers helped to power American industry and infrastructure projects. By the 1850s, most Americans recognized that the country had changed dramatically since its founding. It had grown from a narrow strip of colonies into a vast territory spanning the continent. The economy, initially based on small-scale farming and trade, now included a thriving manufacturing sector. Advancements in communication, including the telegraph, allowed information to spread faster than ever before. A sense of ambition and possibility characterized much of the nation, reflected in the idea of manifest destiny, or the belief that the United States was destined to expand its influence and ideals across the continent. Beneath this optimism, however, festered conflicts that standard political practices and compromises could not permanently resolve. The extension of slavery into new territories became a central dividing line in American politics, and the very future of the Union itself was questioned. Events like the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which allowed settlers in those territories to decide whether to allow slavery by popular vote, led to violent confrontations known as Bleeding Kansas. Political alliances were shifting rapidly, with new parties like the Republican Party formed in 1854, making opposition to the spread of slavery a core platform. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision in 1857, which ruled that African Americans could not be considered citizens and that Congress could not prohibit slavery in the territories, inflamed tensions even further. By the time Abraham Lincoln emerged as a leader in national politics with his debates against Stephen Douglas in 1858, the stage was set for a major political upheaval. Debates over states' rights, the moral question of slavery, and the economic future of the nation had become more pressing than ever. The possibility of an armed conflict loomed on the horizon, as many in the South declared they would not remain in the Union if their interests were threatened. In less than a century since its founding, the United States had transformed into a sprawling and deeply divided country, one where progress in industry, infrastructure, and territory coexisted with stark injustices and growing social conflict. With the election of Lincoln in 1860, tensions reached their breaking point, setting the nation on a course towards civil war. Yet the developments of the early to mid-19th century, from westward exploration and infrastructural innovations to the rise of new political movements, all contributed to shaping the values and structures that would carry forward into future eras. The Industrial Revolution had sparked new forms of growth, but expansion also triggered painful encounters with indigenous peoples, divisive debates about slavery, and a sense of a country on the edge of dramatic change. The stage was now set for a conflict that would test the very idea of the Union and redefine the meaning of freedom in America. By the late 1850s, rising tensions over the future of slavery in new territories and states pushed the United States to the brink of conflict. Despite multiple political compromises aimed at balancing the number of slave and free states, competing ideas about federal power and individual rights had become too large to contain. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 served as a final catalyst. Although Lincoln's platform did not include immediately ending slavery in states where it already existed, many Southerners believed his presidency threatened the spread of slavery and the political strength of the Southern states. One by one, beginning with South Carolina, several Southern states announced their secession from the Union. By early 1861, they had formed the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis as their president. The first shots of a civil war were fired in April 1861 at Fort Sumter, a federal fort in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. When Confederate forces bombarded it, Lincoln responded by calling for volunteers to suppress the rebellion, seeing it as an illegal act against the federal government. This directive drove still more states in the Upper South, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee, to align with the Confederacy, believing that the Union had overstepped its authority. On both sides, leaders and citizens alike expected a quick and decisive conflict, But the war would last 4 long years and claim hundreds of thousands of lives. In the beginning, both the Union and the Confederacy struggled to organize vast armies out of scratch. Civilians turned into soldiers, and local loyalties became national questions. The North held many advantages in terms of industrial production, railroad mileage, and manpower. The South, however, had capable military leadership, a tradition of skilled cavalry, and the psychological advantage of fighting to defend its own soil. Early engagements, such as the First Battle of Bull Run, also known as Manassas, in July 1861, shocked those who had expected a swift Union victory. Confederate forces prevailed in that fight, demonstrating that this conflict would not end quickly or effortlessly. As the war continued, the Union worked to implement the Anaconda Plan, developed by General Winfield Scott. This strategy aimed to blockade southern ports on the Atlantic and Gulf coasts, constricting the Confederacy's ability to export cotton and import supplies. Simultaneously, the Union sought to gain control of the Mississippi River, effectively slicing the Confederacy in half and limiting its capacity to move men and resources. On the Western Front, generals like Ulysses S. Grant achieved key victories at Fort Donelson and Fort Henry, working steadily toward the goal of controlling the major waterways. In the East, however, the Union encountered strong resistance from Confederate generals like Robert E. Lee, whose leadership and tactical skill became legendary. By 1862, the conflict's grim reality was evident in battles such as Shiloh in Tennessee and the 7 Days Battles in Virginia. Casualties soared, wiping away any romantic notions of war. Meanwhile, enslaved individuals in southern states looked to the Union advance as a possible path to freedom, often escaping across Union lines. Lincoln had initially focused on reunifying the country without making slavery the official centerpiece of the war, but the moral and strategic pressure to address slavery's future mounted. After the Battle of Antietam in September 1862, which proved the bloodiest single-day battle in American history, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. When it took effect on January 1, 1863, it declared enslaved people in Confederate-held territories to be free, redefining the conflict as a crusade against slavery. While the proclamation did not immediately free everyone enslaved in the border states loyal to the Union, it gave a clear message that the war was now tied to ending slavery, shifting international sentiment in the Union's favor and allowing African American men to enlist in the Union Army. As the war ground on, 2 significant Union victories in 1863 marked a turning point. The first was the capture of Vicksburg, Mississippi. After a prolonged siege, Vicksburg fell to General Ulysses S. Grant on July 4th, giving the Union total control of the Mississippi River and effectively severing the Confederacy. Around the same time, from July 1st to July 3rd, the Union prevailed at the Battle of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania, repelling Lee's northern invasion. This enormous engagement registered some of the highest casualties of the war, but it also broke the Confederacy's hope of foreign intervention and significantly weakened its offensive capabilities. Emphasizing the ideals that were becoming central to the war effort, Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address in November of that year. Though short, this speech powerfully redefined the purpose of the conflict, dedicating the Union to a new birth of freedom and the principle that all men are created equal. In 1864, Lincoln appointed Grant as the commander of all Union armies, signaling a shift toward relentless pressure on Confederate forces. Grant's strategy, along with William Tecumseh Sherman's destructive march through Georgia and into the Carolinas, wreaked havoc on Southern resources and morale. By early 1865, Lee's army was in retreat, short on supplies and men. The Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia, fell to Union troops in April, and Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th. Other Confederate units followed suit, effectively ending the war. Less than a week later, on April 14th, President Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth at Ford Theater in Washington, D.C. Lincoln's death plunged the nation into grief at a time when it needed healing and guidance more than ever. Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's vice president, became president and assumed the responsibility of leading the country through the difficult process of Reconstruction. Reconstruction posed many hard questions: how to reintegrate the former Confederate states, how to ensure the rights of newly freed African Americans, and how to rebuild infrastructures devastated by the war. Initially, there were different plans for Reconstruction. One approach, often associated with Lincoln himself, favored a relatively lenient process, requiring only 10% of a state's voters to pledge allegiance to the Union to be readmitted. Contrarily, a group in Congress known as the Radical Republicans believed the South should face stricter conditions, both as punishment for the rebellion and as a guarantee of civil rights for former slaves. Andrew Johnson's policies sought to implement Lincoln's plan, but were more lenient still, prompting fierce debates. Johnson, a Democrat from Tennessee who had been chosen as Lincoln's running mate to foster national unity, clashed with the Radical Republicans on nearly every issue related to Reconstruction. He vetoed legislation that aimed to protect the civil rights of African Americans, but Congress overrode many of these vetoes, passing landmark measures like the Civil Rights Act of 1866. This law aimed to provide federal protection against racial discrimination, and it marked one of the first attempts at ensuring equal treatment regardless of race. In 1865, the 13th Amendment was ratified, officially abolishing slavery throughout the United States. Two more amendments would follow during Reconstruction. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, granting citizenship and equal protection under the law to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, including formerly enslaved individuals, and the 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, prohibiting voter discrimination based on race or previous servitude. These three constitutional changes, sometimes called the Reconstruction Amendments, were intended to transform Southern society and integrate freed people into the nation with recognized civil and political rights. Still, enforcing these new rights proved extremely challenging. The Freedmen's Bureau, established in 1865, sought to support formerly enslaved individuals by providing food, clothing, education, and help with labor contracts. Despite its efforts, the sheer scale of need was overwhelming, and the Bureau faced resistance from white Southerners who opposed the social changes that came with freedom for African Americans. Additionally, groups like the Ku Klux Klan emerged, using intimidation and violence to curtail African Americans' newfound civil privileges. Congress responded with enforcement acts, aiming to protect voters and crack down on racist violence. But local compliance was uneven. Amid these conflicts, the Radical Republicans moved to impeach President Johnson in 1868, accusing him of violating the Tenure of Office Act by removing his Secretary of War without congressional approval. Johnson narrowly escaped removal from office by a single vote in the Senate, although this power struggle further demonstrated the deep divisions of the era. By the early 1870s, the intensity of the Radical Republican agenda began to wane as the North grew weary of constant federal intervention in Southern affairs. Economic problems, such as the Panic of 1873, shifted attention away from Reconstruction, and many moderate Republicans began to look for ways to move beyond sectional strife. In the election of 1876, Republican Rutherford B. Hayes ran against Democrat Samuel J. Tilden. Tilden won the popular vote, but the electoral results were disputed in several states. After intense negotiations, Hayes was awarded the presidency in exchange for the withdrawal of federal troops from the South, a decision known as the Compromise of 1877. This effectively ended Reconstruction, with federal troops no longer present to enforce new laws and constitutional amendments. Southern states began to pass Jim Crow laws, restricting African Americans' rights and segregating public facilities. Though Reconstruction officially drew to a close in 1877, the era left behind a significant constitutional and historical legacy. Slavery had been abolished, and the principles of birthright citizenship and equal protection were embedded in the Constitution, setting the stage for future civil rights movements. However, the Civil War and Reconstruction exposed deep flaws and persistent divides. The promise of full equality for African Americans remained unfulfilled for nearly a century after the war's end, and many communities carry the war's scars, physical, economic, and social, for generations. By the close of this chapter, the United States had survived its greatest internal crisis and taken legal steps toward extending liberty to all its citizens. The country had reunited under one flag, but trust between North and South remained uneasy, and racial injustice endured. The Civil War settled the fundamental question that states could not secede from a union. Yet the challenges of achieving a truly just and equitable democracy persisted. Americans gradually shifted their focus toward industrial progress, Western development, and the next wave of social changes. But the lessons and outcomes of the Civil War and Reconstruction would continue to shape the nation in the decades ahead. In 1877, as Reconstruction came to an official end, the United States entered a new chapter of immense economic growth and social transformation. Although the scars of the Civil War and the unresolved challenges of civil rights remained, the nation turned its attention to industrial expansion, urban development, and the promise of prosperity. Historians often call the final decades of the 19th century the Gilded Age, a term popularized by Mark Twain to convey the idea that beneath a glittering surface of progress lay deep social problems, such as income inequality, labor exploitation, and political corruption. In the decades following the war, railroads became the backbone of American industrialization. Construction of transcontinental lines connected the East Coast to the West Coast, tying regions together for trade and migration. Towns sprung up around major rail junctions, and farmers gained access to national and even international markets for their wheat, corn, and cattle. This connectivity also prompted the growth of massive corporations. Rail magnates like Cornelius Vanderbilt amassed fortunes by dominating entire transport routes. At the same time, the steel industry, fueled in part by demand for railroad tracks, grew under figures like Andrew Carnegie, who adopted new production methods that made steel more affordable. As factories churn out steel and other goods, large cities like Chicago, Pittsburgh, and New York teemed with workers searching for jobs. Another pillar of the Gilded Age economy was oil. John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company carved out a near monopoly on the refining and distribution of petroleum products. Using aggressive business tactics, Standard Oil forced smaller competitors to sell out or close. Other industries, from banking to meatpacking, saw similar concentration of power in the hands of relatively few business leaders. These individuals became known as robber barons by critics who believed that their practices hurt competition and exploited workers. Their supporters, however, emphasized how they built infrastructure and drove innovation, contending that these magnates helped propel the nation's technological and industrial prowess. The explosion of industry drew millions of immigrants to the United States. Steamships regularly crossed from Europe to East Coast ports, bringing people from Ireland, Italy, Germany, and Eastern Europe. On the West Coast, immigrants from China and later Japan arrived in considerable numbers. Many newcomers settled in bustling cities, living in crowded tenements while working in factories and sweatshops. Others journeyed to the Great Plains, homesteading on plots of land and hoping to establish thriving farms. Life was difficult for many immigrant families who faced discrimination, low wages, and poor housing. Nativist attitudes also emerged, with groups arguing that new arrivals threatened to outcompete American-born workers and undermine traditional values. This tension led to legislation such as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first major federal law restricting immigration based on nationality. Political corruption was also a hallmark of the Gilded Age. Urban political machines like Tammany Hall in New York City controlled local elections by providing basic services in exchange for votes. In many cases, city officials profited from kickbacks and insider deals. Businesses, for their part, used their wealth to influence local and national politics, sometimes bribing lawmakers to pass favorable legislation or overlook unfair competition. Public frustration mounted against the blending of money and power, but political reform proved difficult. The federal government did pass the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act of 1883, which required that certain government jobs be filled based on merit rather than patronage. Yet corruption remained pervasive in many corners of public life. Despite these problems, the end of the 19th century was a time of optimism for some Americans. Inventions and technological advances, like the telephone developed by Alexander Graham Bell or Thomas Edison's electric light bulb, promised to modernize daily life. Department stores and mail-order catalogs transformed the consumption of goods, bringing more items within reach of the average household. In agriculture, machinery, such as the mechanical reaper, allowed farmers to work larger tracts of land more efficiently. As a result, crop yields increased, but overproduction often depressed prices, leaving many farmers torn between the benefits of technology and the struggle to make ends meet. These frustrated farmers formed alliances, ultimately giving rise to movements like the Populist Party in the 1890s, which pushed for reforms to reduce railroad shipping costs and increase the money supply to ease debt repayment. Toward the end of the 19th century, the United States began to look outward. Fueled by a mix of economic, strategic, and ideological motives, the country expanded its influence abroad. In 1898, the sinking of the battleship USS Maine in Havana Harbor precipitated the Spanish-American War. While the direct cause of the explosion was not definitively clear at the time, sensationalist newspaper accounts stirred public outrage against Spain, which still controlled Cuba. In the subsequent war, the United States decisively defeated Spanish forces in a matter of months. As a result, the United States acquired territories like Puerto Rico and Guam and took on a complex relationship with the Philippines, which had expected independence. This swift victory signaled America's growing reach, positioning the nation as an emerging world power set on establishing overseas markets and naval bases. With a larger global role came renewed debates about America's responsibilities and identity. Some Americans believed in the necessity of what they called the white man's burden, imagining it was the nation's duty to civilize other parts of the world. Others raised objections to imperialistic ventures, warning that colonial expansion betrayed the country's founding ideals of liberty and self-determination. As the U.S. Navy grew, leaders like Admiral Alfred Thayer Mahan advocated for a powerful fleet to safeguard trade routes and protect American interests. It was not long before foreign policy decisions became hotly debated among both politicians and the broader public. Amid these transformations, a progressive era took shape in the early 20th century, driven by reformers who believed that government should actively address social and economic problems. Progressives worried about the extremes of wealth and poverty, the lack of labor protections, and the corrupting force of large monopolies on the political process. Journalists known as muckrakers played a pivotal role in exposing corporate abuses and urban poverty. Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle, revealed horrific conditions in Chicago's meatpacking industry, spurring federal legislation like the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 to ensure safer consumer products. The presidency of Theodore Roosevelt, 1901 to 1909, became synonymous with a progressive cause. Roosevelt believed that the federal government had a duty to regulate big businesses to serve the public interest. He earned a reputation as a trust buster by using the Sherman Antitrust Act to break up monopolies, and he championed environmental conservation by setting aside millions of acres for national parks and wildlife refuges. Roosevelt also engineered the construction of the Panama Canal, significantly shortening the sea route between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans and reinforcing America's emerging naval power. Roosevelt's successor, William Howard Taft, continued some progressive policies but lost favor with the more radical wing of the movement. This led Roosevelt to form his own political group in 1912, the Progressive Party, splitting the Republican vote and allowing Democrat Woodrow Wilson to win the presidency. Wilson pushed further reforms, including the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, which created a central banking system designed to manage the economy and prevent financial crises. He also supported measures like the Clayton Antitrust Act to strengthen government oversight of big businesses. Reforms of the Progressive Era were not limited to economic issues. Activists sought improvements in women's rights, child labor laws, public health, and education. The women's suffrage movement, led by figures like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, took decades of struggle before finally achieving its long-sought goal. In 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified, granting women nationwide the right to vote. This victory represented the culmination of generations of advocacy, parades, protests, and even arrests. Meanwhile, the United States found itself increasingly drawn into global affairs. When World War I erupted in Europe in 1914, Wilson initially advocated neutrality. Nevertheless, German submarine warfare and the sinking of ships with American passengers on board influenced public opinion against the Central Powers. In 1917, the United States declared war on Germany, motivated in part by the Zimmermann Telegram, a secret proposal by Germany to lure Mexico into an alliance against the United States, and by ongoing concerns about attacks on American shipping. The entrance of fresh American troops under General John J. Pershing helped tip the balance in favor of the Allied powers. Although the war ended in 1918 with Germany's surrender, negotiations at the peace conference proved complicated. Wilson introduced his 14 points, advocating for an international organization to prevent future conflicts, which led to the creation of the League of Nations. The U.S. Senate, however, refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, largely due to fears that membership in the League could limit America's independence in foreign affairs. This rejection dampened Wilson's vision of American leadership on the global stage, but did not diminish the fact that the war had already boosted the country's standing in world politics. By the 1920s, the United States emerged as a global economic powerhouse. War-torn European nations owed significant debts to American banks, and American industries were strongly positioned in international trade. Yet domestically, the nation faced an array of new challenges, from racial tensions and discrimination against African Americans moving north in the Great Migration to cultural debates sparked by the changing social norms of the Roaring Twenties. Many of the progressive era's achievements influenced public policy for decades to come, but some of the era's ambitions, like putting an end to systemic poverty or fully protecting workers' rights, remained only partially realized. In these final decades of the 19th century and the opening years of the 20th, the United States evolved dramatically. The Gilded Age witnessed the accumulation of colossal fortunes and the rapid rise of urban centers, while the Progressive Era sought to correct the imbalances and abuses that came with swift industrial success. The Spanish-American War and World War I propelled the country onto the global stage, reshaping American identity and influence in ways that few had anticipated during the Civil War era. This mixture of technological progress, social reform, and ambitious foreign policy laid the groundwork for the modern United States, which would soon confront new economic upheavals and international conflicts as the century continued. As World War I drew to a close in 1918, the United States faced a new, rapidly changing landscape. Many Americans experienced a sense of relief and optimism following an intense period of global conflict. Soldiers returning from Europe brought new perspectives on the world and hopes of a better future, while home front industries that had ramped up for wartime production pivoted to meet peacetime needs. Despite the challenges connected with demobilization and a sudden reduction in military spending, the economy in the early 1920s appeared boundless to many citizens. This feeling of confidence trickled into different aspects of American society, capturing the spirit of what would become known as the Roaring Twenties. However, this post-war optimism coincided with social and cultural tensions. The reintegration of veterans, rising labor costs, and competition for jobs led to a wave of labor strikes and demonstrations. Conservative attitudes clashed with liberal ones, and the Red Scare of 1919 reflected widespread fear that radical communism might take hold in the country. This unsettled environment fueled suspicion of immigrants with certain political leanings. Laws like the Immigration Act of 1924 set strict quotas, favoring immigrants from Northern and Western Europe while severely limiting those from Southern and Eastern Europe and nearly all newcomers from Asia. These restrictions illustrated the nation's overall ambivalence, caught between embracing progress and clinging to older notions of social hierarchy. Amid these underlying tensions, the economy continued to thrive for much of the 1920s. Assembly lines and mass production techniques revolutionized industry, most famously at Ford Motor Company, where Henry Ford perfected the moving assembly line for automobiles. By making cars efficiently and affordably, Ford changed the way Americans moved, worked, and even spent their leisure time. Rising wages for some sectors, along with easy credit, encouraged consumerism on an unprecedented scale. Radios, refrigerators, phonographs, and other household items became must-have commodities for middle-class families. Cinemas attracted regular crowds with silent films and, later, talkies, adding a vibrant new dimension to American entertainment. These years also witnessed a wave of cultural creativity, particularly in music and literature. Jazz, an innovative form of music shaped by African American communities, gained popularity across racial and regional lines. Speakeasies, clandestine bars born out of prohibition laws, enacted by the 18th Amendment starting in 1920, offered not only illegal alcohol but also jazz bands and dance floors. Cities like New York and Chicago experienced a nightlife boom. Writers of the Lost Generation found inspiration in disillusionment after the war. Scott Fitzgerald's novels captured the mixture of excess and emptiness that many associated with the time, while Harlem in New York became a center for Black culture and artistic expression. The Harlem Renaissance showcased authors like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, who wrote about African American life with unprecedented creativity and depth. Yet the newfound prosperity did not extend equally to all Americans. Farmers in particular struggled. During World War I, farmers had expanded production to supply the U.S. military and Allied forces. But once peace returned, food prices fell steeply. Many rural families found themselves burdened by debt, and foreclosures became more common. Racial inequality persisted, with Jim Crow laws reinforcing segregation in southern states. Instances of racially motivated violence continued in various parts of the country, revealing the deep schisms that undermined any illusion of universal progress. Despite these hardships, widespread belief in the strength of American capitalism continued to bolster the market. Stocks appeared to rise irresistibly, attracting not just professional investors, but also ordinary people hoping to make quick fortunes through speculation. The euphoric rise of the stock market would come crashing down in October 1929 in an event commonly referred to as the Wall Street crash. On Black Tuesday, massive sell orders overwhelmed the trading floor, driving prices into a downward spiral. In the months that followed, observers gradually realized that the crash was not just a temporary correction, but the beginning of a profound economic downturn. Banks, having lent freely during the boom, found themselves short on liquidity when individuals and businesses defaulted on their loans. As banks failed, ordinary people lost their life savings. Weakened institutions stopped granting credit, causing a vicious cycle where businesses could not secure capital to maintain production or payroll. Unemployment skyrocketed and consumer demand plummeted. This economic collapse, known as the Great Depression, soon engulfed the entire country. Factories closed, families lost their homes, and desperation descended on communities once brimming with hope. Soup kitchens and bread lines became common sights. Those who had grown used to the affluence of the 1920s faced the harsh reality of vanished jobs and limited resources. Many Americans migrated in search of work, crowding cities, or traveling to states like California in hopes of finding any opportunity. In rural areas, environmental disasters compounded hardships. Overfarming and drought conditions contributed to the Dust Bowl, a catastrophe across the Great Plains that saw strong winds pick up topsoil and blow it away. Harvests failed, leaving entire regions impoverished and unable to sustain agriculture. The severity of the crisis reshaped American politics. In 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected president in a landslide, defeating the incumbent Herbert Hoover, who had been widely criticized for not doing enough to combat the Depression. Roosevelt took office in 1933, promising a New Deal for the American people, a series of government-driven programs intended to promote economic recovery and provide relief to the unemployed. In his first 100 days, Roosevelt oversaw the creation of major agencies and policies. The Emergency Banking Act aimed to stabilize the banking system, while the Civilian Conservation Corps hired young men for conservation projects, and the Agricultural Adjustment Administration sought to control overproduction by paying farmers to leave land fallow. These measures, among others, reflected Roosevelt's bold approach to reversing the devastating trends strangling the economy. The New Deal transformed the federal government's relationship with citizens. Before then, federal intervention in economic matters was relatively minimal. Roosevelt's administration, in contrast, shifted that approach, using public funds to create jobs, support agriculture, and regulate business practices. Programs like the Works Progress Administration put millions of people back to work constructing roads, bridges, and buildings that still stand today. Artists, writers, and actors were employed under federal programs to create murals, perform plays, and compile oral histories. Social Security, established in 1935, provided pensions for retirees and laid the groundwork for a modern social safety net. Despite these large-scale efforts, the Depression lingered throughout the 1930s, and critics from multiple sides emerged. Some believed that Roosevelt was exercising too much power and risked turning the United States into a country dependent on government aid. Others argued that the New Deal did not go far enough, leaving many African Americans, immigrants, and rural poor without adequate relief or protection from discrimination. Internationally, the American focus on domestic recovery kept attention turned inward, even as storms gathered overseas. In Europe, the aftermath of World War I and the burden of reparations had fueled political instability, allowing totalitarian regimes to take power in Germany under Adolf Hitler and in Italy under Benito Mussolini. Japan, for its part, pursued an imperialist expansion throughout East Asia. The League of Nations struggled to maintain the peace that Woodrow Wilson had hoped it would secure, largely because it lacked enforcement power and the United States never joined. Conflict around the globe started to escalate, including the invasion of Manchuria by Japan in 1931 and militarism in Germany that threatened the European balance. Meanwhile, Americans generally hoped to stay out of any new entanglements, recalling the devastating consequences of the Great War and focusing on domestic recovery. Despite widespread isolationist sentiment, Roosevelt sensed the growing threats abroad. As the 1930s wore on, he looked for ways to support countries facing aggression while avoiding a direct military commitment. The Neutrality Acts passed by Congress set strict limits on how the United States could interact with nations at war, reflecting a strong inclination to avoid past mistakes. Nonetheless, Roosevelt's administration gradually relaxed these acts to allow the sale of weapons and supplies to allies under programs like cash and carry, demonstrating a careful shift from absolute neutrality. By the close of the decade, the global situation was becoming impossible to ignore. Hitler's annexations in Europe, combined with Japan's continued expansion in Asia, signaled that another large-scale conflict might be inevitable. For Americans at the end of the 1930s, daily life still hinged on the pacing of economic recovery. Even as some improvements took hold, unemployment remained high, and the sense of security that had characterized the 1920s was long gone. Yet Roosevelt's New Deal had made lasting changes in how citizens saw their government and its potential responsibilities. In forging a more active federal role, the administration reshaped politics and laid foundations for future debates about welfare, labor protections, and economic regulation. With war clouds looming, however, new demands would soon clash with the still fragile economy, testing the resilience of the nation once more. By 1939, the United States stood on the precipice of yet another major upheaval. Storms of conflict in Europe and Asia gained force, eventually sweeping the country into World War II, despite lingering memories of the dreadful losses of the First World War. In that setting, America faced monumental decisions that would redefine its place in the world. Citizens who had endured Prohibition, the Great Depression, and various crises of the interwar period would be called upon to unite, mobilize, and apply their collective energy to a global conflict. The decades between these two world wars represented a prolonged struggle with economic hardship and social adjustment, setting the stage for a transformation that would profoundly alter not only the United States, but also the course of international affairs. As the 1930s drew to a close, conflicts that had been brewing around the world exploded into open warfare. Europe became the focal point of immense upheaval when Nazi Germany, led by Adolf Hitler, invaded Poland in September 1939, prompting Britain and France to declare war. In Asia, Imperial Japan had already marched deeper into China, intent on expanding its empire. These simultaneous developments crystallized into what would become World War II, a conflict that soon engulfed nations on multiple continents. Initially, the United States sought to remain officially neutral. Memories of the losses from World War I were still fresh, and many Americans believed that the nation should avoid another overseas entanglement. Yet the Roosevelt administration also saw that aggressive totalitarian regimes would threaten not only Europe and Asia, but ultimately American security and ideals as well. In an attempt to balance neutrality with the need to prepare for potential conflict, the U.S. Congress passed the Neutrality Acts during the mid-1930s, restricting arms sales to warring countries. But as Germany sped through Europe and subjugated nations like France, American isolationism began to wane. Recognizing the urgency of aiding the Allies, President Franklin D. Roosevelt introduced the cash and carry policy that allowed Britain to buy armaments as long as it paid cash and transported them on its own ships. This policy aimed to keep American vessels out of harm's way while still extending crucial support to those battling the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and later Japan. By 1940, Nazi Germany had overrun much of Western Europe, and Britain stood virtually alone. Roosevelt found ways to assist the British further without formally entering the war. The Lend-Lease Act of 1941 authorized the U.S. to send large quantities of military equipment and supplies to Britain, the Soviet Union, once it was attacked by Germany in June of that year, and other Allied nations on the premise that those countries would return or pay back the aid eventually. Though the United States was still not officially at war, the Lend-Lease program made it the arsenal of democracy, keeping vital war materials flowing into Allied hands. The more direct trigger for U.S. involvement came on December 7, 1941, when Japan launched a surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. This devastating raid killed over 2,000 Americans, destroyed or damaged numerous ships, and shocked the nation. Roosevelt called December 7th a date which will live in infamy, and Congress declared war on Japan the following day. Almost immediately, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, pulling the nation fully into the global conflict. In an instant, the question of interference abroad gave way to a single, unifying goal: defeating the Axis powers. Mobilizing for war required a significant transformation of the entire U.S. economy and society. Factories previously making automobiles or other consumer goods converted their production lines to churn out tanks, airplanes, and ammunition. Wartime needs also spurred scientific and technological advances. Scientists and engineers worked on radar, synthetic materials, and the development of more refined aircraft. The Manhattan Project, one of the most secretive state-sponsored science programs in history, aimed to develop an atomic bomb before any rival power could do the same. Under the guidance of figures like physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer, the project enlisted many of the world's leading scientists in a race against time, eventually producing a weapon with destructive force beyond all previous imagination. On the home front, the war effort demanded a massive workforce. Millions of men enlisted or were drafted into the military, while women entered factories and offices in unprecedented numbers. Rosie the Riveter became a cultural icon, representing the women who took on industrial work once reserved for men. These women riveted aircraft hulls, welded ship components, and operated heavy machinery. Additionally, minorities sought new opportunities, leading to demographic changes in many parts of the country. The Great Migration of African Americans from the rural South to industrial centers in the North and West accelerated as better-paying jobs became available. This shift, however, also ignited racial tensions and sometimes violent confrontation, just as before, but now against a backdrop of urgent production needs for the war. Japanese Americans, in particular, faced an especially harsh consequence of fear-driven policies. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, many Americans questioned the loyalty of Japanese descent communities, particularly on the West Coast. Under Executive Order 9066, signed by President Roosevelt in February 1942, over 100,000 Japanese Americans, two-thirds of whom were American citizens, were forcibly relocated from their homes into internment camps. They lived under guarded conditions, losing their businesses, farms, and properties. This act of mass incarceration reflected a broader national anxiety, but also blatant prejudice that swept away constitutional safeguards. Only decades later did the U.S. government formally acknowledge the injustice and offer reparations. While the U.S. mobilized on the home front, its military forces teamed with allies to fight on multiple fronts worldwide. In Europe, an initial Germany-first strategy was adopted, reflecting the view that Nazi Germany posed the greatest immediate danger. American troops participated in the North Africa Campaign, then in the invasion of Italy, encountering formidable German defenses. Meanwhile, on June 6, 1944 D-Day, Allied forces launched a massive assault on German-occupied France by storming the beaches of Normandy. Under the command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, this invasion opened a new front in Western Europe, pressuring Nazi forces already stretched by fierce Soviet resistance on the Eastern Front. As the Allies advanced, Germany faced inevitable defeat. In April 1945, with Soviet forces closing in on Berlin from the east and Western armies moving in from other directions, Adolf Hitler committed suicide. By early May, Germany officially surrendered, bringing an end to the war in Europe, Victory in Europe Day, or V-Day. Nevertheless, the conflict in the Pacific persisted. U.S. forces have been employing an island-hopping strategy, seizing strategically important islands and bypassing others to move closer to the Japanese mainland. This brutal campaign featured battles such as Iwo Jima and Okinawa, with high casualties on both sides. Despite the Allies' steadily closing grip, Japanese leaders appeared unwilling to surrender. That changed with the use of the atomic bomb. Faced with projections of massive Allied casualties if a traditional invasion of Japan was undertaken, President Harry S. Truman, who had assumed office after Roosevelt passed away in April 1945, authorized nuclear strikes on Hiroshima, August 6th, and Nagasaki, August 9th. These bombings killed tens of thousands of people instantly and led to far more death from radiation and injuries. While moral and ethical debates about this decision continue to the present day, the Japanese government announced its surrender on August 15th, and formal documents were signed on September 2nd, 1945. World War II was over, and the world stood in shock at both the devastation wrought and the novel power the atomic bomb represented. The aftermath of World War II carried profound consequences for the United States and the global community. Economically, America emerged from the war stronger than ever. Factories had run at maximum capacity during the conflict, many untouched by the destruction faced by European and Asian industrial centers. With the war ended, pent-up consumer demand fueled an economic boom. Veterans returned home, aided by the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, the GI Bill, which provided financial support for education, housing, and business loans. Suburbs rapidly expanded, exemplified by developments like Levittown in New York, tailoring neighborhoods for returning servicemen and their families. Politics, too, shifted. The United States and the Soviet Union, once cautious wartime allies, emerged as global superpowers with vastly different ideologies. While the Western Allies had championed forms of democracy and capitalism, the Soviet Union had endured great losses, but also expanded the reach of its communist system into Eastern Europe. Wartime alliances dissolved into a profound rivalry that came to define the post-war era, the Cold War. This ideological confrontation manifested in an arms race, space race, and a series of proxy wars across the globe. Though the two superpowers avoided direct full-scale conflict out of fear of nuclear annihilation. In 1945, leaders from the Allied nations established the United Nations, seeking an international body that could preserve peace more effectively than the defunct League of Nations. The UN included a Security Council with 5 permanent members: the United States, the Soviet Union, later Russia, the United Kingdom, France, and China, each holding veto power over major decisions. Although the organization would face many political stalemates, especially driven by US-Soviet tension, it became a cornerstone for global diplomacy, humanitarian efforts, and the establishment of international norms. Back home, Americans grappled with the social changes catalyzed by the war. The contributions of women and minority communities to wartime production and military service sparked calls for greater civil rights. In the immediate post-war years, civil rights activism gathered momentum, pushing the government to address long-standing discrimination in employment, voting, and public accommodations. While President Truman took initial steps, such as desegregating the armed forces in 1948, nationwide change remained slow. Nonetheless, growing public awareness and activism set the stage for the major civil rights battles that would unfold in the following decades. Simultaneously, cultural shifts emerged. American tastes in music, fashion, and leisure began to reflect a blend of wartime experiences and new economic confidence. Movie theaters drew unprecedented crowds, and radio remained popular until the advent of mass television ownership in the 1950s further transformed home entertainment. By this time, the baby boom, a spike in birth rates between the mid-1940s and early 1960s, substantially increased the population, reinforcing the suburban lifestyle and consumer-oriented ideals. Prosperity and progress became defining narratives for the new middle class, even as not all Americans shared equally in these advantages. Economically, the U.S. government sought to prevent a relapse into the Great Depression. The Employment Act of 1946 declared a national policy to promote maximum employment, production, and purchasing power, leading to greater government involvement in economic matters. Infrastructure investments, scientific research, much of it propelled by wartime projects, and the expansion of higher education drove innovation and helped sustain growth. Still, age-old issues such as racism, poverty, and regional disparities persisted, underscoring that prosperity, while widespread by historical standards, was neither universal nor guaranteed. In foreign policy, the immediate years after World War II were characterized by the Marshall Plan, a U.S. program providing economic aid to rebuild war-torn European countries. The logic behind this massive financial support, championed by Secretary of State George C. Marshall, was that economic stability would prevent the spread of communism, strengthen U.S.-friendly governments, and create markets for American goods. The plan helped accelerate Western Europe's recovery, forging a strong bond between the United States and nations like Britain, France, and West Germany, even as it heightened rivalries with the Soviet Union, which set up its own economic structures within its sphere of influence. By the end of the 1940s, the lines of the Cold War were drawn. Institutions like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, formed in 1949, forging a military alliance between the U.S., Canada, and several European nations. NATO's premise rested on collective security. An attack on one member was considered an attack on all. The subsequent decades would see global politics revolve around these power blocks, with proxy conflicts flaring in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Thus, World War II and the immediate post-war years ushered the United States into an era of global dominance, unparalleled economic growth, and heightened social awareness. The cost in lives had been considerable, Over 400,000 American soldiers were lost, and millions more were killed worldwide in one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. Yet the conflict also spurred technological, industrial, and cultural changes that irrevocably shaped the modern world. If the post-World War I period left the U.S. caught between economic optimism and looming catastrophe, the period after World War II placed the nation undeniably at the epicenter of global affairs. Forthcoming battles, most of them ideological, some turning to armed proxies, would revolve around how deeply American ideals and economic models could reshape a divided planet, and how effectively the country could address its own internal contradictions of democracy during a time of rising civil rights demands. This new world order would define American policy and identity for decades to come, setting the stage for the post-war prosperity, the Cold War, and an ongoing struggle to match national rhetoric with reality at home and abroad. By the mid-1940s, the United States had emerged from World War II as a dominant global power with economic strength unparalleled almost anywhere else in the world. Yet, even as the victory celebrations ended, the alliance with the Soviet Union gave way to suspicions and ideological rivalry. In the space of just a few years, the two wartime partners stood on opposite sides of a global divide, each committed to expanding its ideological influence. This confrontation, which came to be known as the Cold War, shaped foreign policy, domestic politics, and broader social changes throughout the late 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s. At the same time, a powerful civil rights movement transformed America from within, challenging centuries of racial injustice. Together, these forces defined a pivotal era in U.S. history, marked by both heightened fears of communism and the remarkable courage of grassroots activism. In the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, tensions with the Soviet Union escalated quickly. Stalin's determination to create a buffer zone of communist-aligned states in Eastern Europe alarmed policymakers in Washington, who saw these events as Soviet expansionism. Winston Churchill famously spoke of an Iron Curtain descending over the continent, responding to worries that desperation in war-torn regions could give communism a foothold. The United States enacted the Marshall Plan, providing billions of dollars to rebuild European economies. This plan helped Western Europe recover, drew nations more tightly into America's economic orbit, and heightened rivalries with the Soviet Union. Disputes flared, culminating in moments like the Berlin blockade, 1948 to 1949, when the Soviet Union cut off Allied access to West Berlin. The U.S. answered with an around-the-clock airlift of supplies that kept the beleaguered city alive and delivered a powerful symbol of American resolve. These circumstances prompted the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, in 1949, an alliance whose guiding principle held that an attack on one member was an attack on all. The Soviets countered with the Warsaw Pact in 1955, aligning Eastern European states under the shadow of Moscow's leadership. Meanwhile, the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, underscored the global scope of the conflict. When North Korea, backed by the Soviets and later by the Chinese, invaded the South, the United States led a United Nations force to intervene. The resulting three-year war ended in a stalemate, with the peninsula still divided at the 38th parallel. Although it remained a limited war, Korean battlefields showed how the Cold War took on a strong military dimension, with superpowers jockeying for influence on multiple continents. On the home front, the Cold War spurred a climate of suspicion commonly known as the Second Red Scare. Fear that Soviet spies had penetrated American institutions led to heightened scrutiny of public figures, government employees, and ordinary citizens. Senator Joseph McCarthy rose to fame by claiming, often without evidence, that communists held key positions in government. In Congress, the House Un-American Activities Committee, WAC, investigated Hollywood, leading to a blacklist that ruined the careers of many actors, screenwriters, and directors accused of communist sympathies. High-profile cases, such as those of Alger Hiss and Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, further fueled the belief that communist infiltration threatened the nation from within. Though McCarthy eventually overreached by accusing army officials and respected figures of treason, leading to his downfall, the broader culture of fear profoundly shaped American life in the early 1950s. Under President Dwight D. Eisenhower, elected in 1952, the United States maintained a policy of containment, resisting the expansion of communism while trying to avoid direct armed confrontation with the Soviet Union. Eisenhower's reliance on nuclear deterrence and the threat of massive retaliation contributed to an arms race that saw both the U.S. and the Soviet Union amass terrifying stockpiles of atomic and hydrogen bombs. Ordinary citizens, meanwhile, practiced duck and cover drills and built bomb shelters in their backyards, reflecting the pervasive anxiety of a possible nuclear conflict. Scientific rivalry also spilled into space. In 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, shocking Americans who had assumed they held the technological edge. This development accelerated the space race, culminating in major U.S. investments in science education, research, and the eventual creation of NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, in 1958. While foreign policy and national security held center stage, a profound movement for racial justice gathered momentum, leading directly into the transformative era of the African American civil rights movement. After World War II, returning black veterans questioned why they had fought for freedoms abroad that were denied to them at home. Challenges to segregation and discrimination intensified. In 1948, President Harry Truman ordered the desegregation of the armed forces, signaling federal willingness to address some racial inequalities. Yet local and state barriers across the South and many de facto restrictions in the North remained firmly in place. In 1954, the Supreme Court issued its landmark decision in Brown v. Board of Education, ruling that racial segregation of children in public schools was inherently unequal and thus unconstitutional. This unanimous decision overturned the older separate but equal doctrine which had justified segregated facilities for decades. Resistance to Brown, however, was fierce in some southern states, demonstrating that legal victories alone would not suffice. The following year, the brutal murder of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old black boy from Chicago visiting Mississippi, galvanized activists who felt that centuries of racist violence had to be confronted publicly. Around the same time, Rosa Parks' decision in 1955 to refuse to give up her seat on a segregated bus in Montgomery, Alabama, ignited a 381-day boycott organized by the local black community. Emerging from this protest was a young preacher, Martin Luther King Jr., whose leadership style of nonviolent resistance drew inspiration from Christian teachings and figures like Mahatma Gandhi. The success of the boycott, culminating in a Supreme Court ruling that segregated buses were unconstitutional, sparked new confidence. Black churches became crucial organizing centers, and civil rights groups like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee proliferated, orchestrating sit-ins, marches, and voter registration campaigns across the South. Under massive social and political pressure, the federal government began to act. The Civil Rights Act of 1957, the first such legislation since Reconstruction, aimed to protect voter rights, though it proved difficult to enforce. Resistance in schools continued. In 1957, 9 black students in Little Rock, Arkansas, faced vehement hostility on their first day attending Central High School. Eisenhower felt compelled to send federal troops to protect them, marking the first time since the post-Civil War era that federal forces were used to uphold African American civil rights in the South. Despite these efforts, deep-seated patterns of discrimination persisted, prompting ever larger demonstrations in the early 1960s. A new decade brought a new administration when John F. Kennedy won the presidency in 1960. Though he campaigned on energizing the nation, much of his early term was overshadowed by Cold War crises. In 1961, a disastrous U.S.-backed invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs tarnished his start in foreign policy. More perilous yet was the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, when Soviet attempts to place nuclear missiles on Cuban soil brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. tense negotiations ultimately defused the standoff, and both superpowers realized how close they had come to catastrophe. This moment reaffirmed the intense peril of the arms race, even as it briefly inspired hopes of more thorough negotiation. Domestically, Kennedy's administration intersected with civil rights activism that was reaching unprecedented heights. Demonstrations in places like Birmingham, Alabama, where peaceful protesters faced attacks by police dogs and fire hoses, shocked the nation. A watershed moment occurred in August 1963, when over 200,000 marchers descended on Washington, D.C., to advocate for jobs and freedom. There, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, highlighting the moral imperative to end racial stratification. Pressure built on Congress to pass sweeping legislation. After Kennedy's assassination in November 1963, President Lyndon B. Johnson used his political acumen to push through the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited discrimination in public accommodations, employment, and federally funded programs. A year later, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 further strengthened federal oversight of voting practices in states with a history of disenfranchising black citizens. While the civil rights movement tackled America's foundational inequalities, broader social transformations continued apace. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, suburbia expanded rapidly. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 funded the interstate system, facilitating the creation of new communities outside crowded urban centers. Many returning veterans took advantage of the GI Bill to buy homes, obtain higher education, and settle into the growing middle class. This upward mobility, however, was not equally distributed. Restrictive covenants often barred African Americans and other minorities from certain neighborhoods, thereby contributing to patterns of segregation that still persist. Youth culture also underwent considerable change, fueled by rising prosperity and technological developments like television. Teenagers were increasingly recognized as a distinct demographic, their music and style forging new cultural norms. Rock and roll, pioneered by radio DJs, record producers, and musicians such as Chuck Berry and Elvis Presley, transformed the popular music landscape and contributed to generational rifts, as parents often struggled to accept new forms of youthful expression. Beyond music, the 1960s saw seeds of the counterculture movement that would fully blossom later in the decade. Motivated by opposition to war, demand for more personal freedom, and experiments in communal living and alternative spirituality. Women's roles evolved considerably as well. While many suburban households adhered to the traditional structure of a male breadwinner and a female homemaker, a growing number of women began to question these constraints. Betty Friedan's 1963 publication, The Feminine Mystique, exposed widespread dissatisfaction among educated homemakers, helping to catalyze what would be known as second-wave feminism. Though still in its formative stages, this movement would soon push for reforms in employment, reproductive rights, and societal attitudes toward female independence. By the mid-1960s, the Cold War raged on, yet the direct confrontation between superpowers remained largely contained. Instead, proxy conflicts flared across the globe, with the U.S. becoming entangled in places like Southeast Asia. Meanwhile, reforms spurred by the civil rights movement were reshaping the country's legal landscape. In daily American life, suburbanization, mass media, youth culture, and a burgeoning sense of social justice were all on the rise. These currents together produced an era of optimism and turbulence, demonstrating the nation's capacity for dynamic growth alongside stubborn divisions. The late 1940s through the 1960s thus stands as a pivotal period in American history. At the international level, the Cold War set the stage for confrontation and innovation, propelling both technological achievements, like the space program, and fears of catastrophic conflict. At home, civil rights struggled against entrenched racism, often forcing the federal government and judicial systems to define and protect basic freedoms more assertively than ever before. Socially, affluent suburban life and a blossoming entertainment culture promised comfort and leisure, even as competing voices pointed out inequities of gender, race, and class. In the coming years, the Vietnam War would further strain the nation's ideals, testing commitments to democracy abroad and fueling widespread domestic opposition. Yet for all the upheaval, this period demonstrated the resilience of individuals and organizations who, whether challenging global communism or centuries of racial hierarchy, believed that shaping a better future was indeed possible. In the early 1960s, American politics, society, and culture found themselves on converging paths of transformation that set the stage for a turbulent decade. John F. Kennedy's election in 1960 heralded a new generation of political leadership, emphasized by his call for a new frontier of scientific and social progress. Although his time in office was cut short by assassination, Kennedy's presidency featured significant developments, including the Bay of Pigs fiasco, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and early steps towards supporting civil rights legislation. His successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, steered the country toward a more robust government role in social welfare and oversaw a massive escalation in the Vietnam War. Meanwhile, a growing chorus of young people challenged social norms, decried racial injustice, and questioned the motives and morality of U.S. foreign policy. These overlapping currents of change defined an era of protest, upheaval, and legislative reform that would permanently alter the nation's course. Kennedy entered office in January 1961 at the height of the Cold War. After an unsuccessful CIA-backed invasion of Cuba's Bay of Pigs in April of that year, criticism dogged his administration's foreign policy approach. Tensions amplified when the Soviet Union sought to station nuclear missiles in Cuba in 1962. The resulting Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world dangerously close to nuclear conflict before a negotiated settlement led to the removal of Soviet missiles in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba and a quieter pledge to remove American missiles from Turkey. This dramatic episode, which played out on television screens and radio broadcasts, underscored the precarious balance of power in global politics and hammered home the risks of potential nuclear war. Kennedy took modest but significant steps to secure civil rights. He issued executive orders on housing discrimination, for instance, and proposed sweeping legislation against segregation. Tragically, his presidency ended with his assassination in Dallas on November 22, 1963. This national trauma ushered in Lyndon B. Johnson, a seasoned Senate Majority Leader from Texas, whose political savvy helped push through pivotal civil rights legislation begun under Kennedy. Johnson's Great Society agenda aimed to expand social programs, eliminate poverty, and enhance educational opportunities. Programs such as Medicare, Medicaid, and food assistance were enacted, laying the groundwork for modern social services. Yet, as Johnson steered these ambitious domestic reforms, another issue began to dominate his presidency: Vietnam. The Vietnam conflict traced its roots to French colonialism and the post-World War II struggle for independence led by Ho Chi Minh. By the early 1960s, the United States had been sending military advisors to support the South Vietnamese government against the Communist North and the Viet Cong insurgency. After the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, when two reported attacks on U.S. Navy ships prompted Congress to grant Johnson broad military powers, American involvement ballooned. Troop deployment soared, and by the late 1960s, hundreds of thousands of American soldiers were fighting in Vietnam. Nightly news segments broadcast stark battle images and rising casualty counts, bringing the war into living rooms across the nation. A spirited anti-war movement emerged, led initially by college students and later involving clergy, civil rights leaders, and famously prominent entertainers. Draft cards were burned at demonstrations. Teach-ins and marches galvanized a generation disillusioned by government claims of progress. The war also sparked intense debates about patriotism, morality, and America's global role. Scenes of protest clashes with law enforcement, sometimes marked by tear gas and mass arrests, revealed widening rifts in public opinion. By the end of the decade, the war's growing unpopularity had begun to overshadow Johnson's domestic achievements, and in March 1968, the president announced he would not seek re-election, citing the profound divisions tearing at the fabric of society. The year 1968 was especially tumultuous. In April, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, triggering uprisings in multiple cities. Once the face of nonviolence, King left behind a complex legacy of moral leadership that had reshaped the nation's consciousness about race and justice. Just 2 months later, Robert F. Kennedy, running for the Democratic presidential nomination on an anti-war platform, was assassinated in Los Angeles. These tragedies, combined with iconic images of conflict in Vietnam, sharpened a widespread sense of crisis and loss. That same year, the Democratic National Convention in Chicago descended into chaos as police confronted demonstrators in a brutal crackdown, images of which further fueled the public's feeling of political instability. Republican Richard Nixon won the presidency in 1968 by pledging to restore law and order and promising a secret plan to end the Vietnam War. Once in office, he gradually reduced the number of U.S. troops in Vietnam while intensifying bombing campaigns to press North Vietnam into a negotiated peace. This strategy, often termed Vietnamization, aimed to shift the fighting on South Vietnamese forces as American troops withdrew. Domestically, Nixon's presidency brought surprising developments, including the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, and significant expansions of federal powers in environmental regulation. Yet behind the scenes, secret bombing in Cambodia and Laos further stirred anti-war sentiment, culminating in events like the May 1970 shooting of unarmed protesters at Kent State University by National Guardsmen, a tragedy that inflamed public outcry against the war. Beyond Vietnam, the late 1960s and the early 1970s rocked the nation with major social and cultural realignments. The civil rights movement expanded to address issues of economic and political equality, as illustrated by the rise of Black Power advocates who insisted on more radical changes than what mainstream leaders typically pursued. Women's liberation gained momentum too, fueled by the publication of Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique in 1963 and the formation of organizations like the National Organization for Women. Now, activists demanded equal pay, reproductive rights, and an end to systemic sexism that pervaded workplaces and cultural norms. Young people, often dubbed the counterculture, embraced freer attitudes towards sexuality, fashion, and drug use, challenging long-standing social prescriptions. This ferment showed itself in events like the 1967 Summer of Love in San Francisco and the seminal Woodstock Music Festival in 1969, both famous for their celebration of peace, love, and rock music. The nation's political storms converged in the early 1970s. Efforts to secure a peace settlement in Vietnam culminated in the Paris Peace Accords of 1973, leading to the withdrawal of the remaining U.S. combat troops. South Vietnam, however, fell to the North 2 years later. Domestically, the Nixon administration's initially strong approval ratings tanked amid the unfolding Watergate scandal, triggered by a break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters in 1972 and a subsequent cover-up implicated at the highest levels of government. The slow, methodical investigation by reporters and Congress revealed extensive abuses of power. Facing imminent impeachment, Nixon became the first U.S. president to resign in August 1974, tarnishing public trust in government. His successor, Gerald Ford, oversaw continued economic troubles and dealt with the aftermath of Vietnam, but the scars left by Watergate continued to shape the public's view of political ethics and accountability. During these same years, social progress persisted. Congress passed Title IX in 1972, prohibiting sex-based discrimination in federally funded education, a watershed moment for women's sports and academic opportunities. The Supreme Court's 1973 decision in Roe v. Wade expanded privacy rights to include access to abortion, igniting a deeply polarizing debate that reverberates to this day. Environmental activism joined the national mainstream. The first Earth Day in 1970 attracted millions of participants, while subsequent Clean Air and Water Acts reflected a heightened public commitment to ecological stewardship. By the mid-1970s, The United States had weathered a bitter war, the unraveling of a president's credibility, and sweeping cultural upheaval. The civil rights movement had gained important legal victories, yet de facto inequalities and controversies around busing for school integration underlined that major challenges remained. The feminist movement secured legal achievements, but women still faced obstacles in pay equity, professional advancement, and societal expectations. The counterculture receded somewhat as a cohesive movement, yet its influence on music, fashion, and personal freedoms had already reshaped American life for good. Pop culture, from the Rolling Stones to the new phenomenon of blockbuster films, revealed a public seeking both escapism and meaningful engagement with social realities. The end of the Vietnam era, then, did not simply seal off a few chapters of U.S. history. Instead, it signaled a transition into a more complicated modern America, one in which trust in elected leaders was significantly eroded, yet democratic activism and social reform had proven productive in challenging many long-standing inequalities. Technological innovation and economic tides would soon bring additional layers of complexity, from oil embargoes to personal computing advances. But by the late 1970s, one thing was clear. After years of war, demonstrations, and leaps in cultural expression, the United States was not the same country it had been in 1960. A new political generation, shaped by protest, skepticism, and a search for deeper values, continued to build on the achievements and reckon with the limitations of a tumultuous era. In this way, the Vietnam and counterculture years carved paths for the nation's future, affirming the capacity for large-scale change while reminding Americans that true progress often requires struggle, sacrifice, and collective vision. By the early 1970s, the United States was dealing not only with internal divisions exacerbated by the Vietnam War and the profound social upheavals of the 1960s, but also with a major crisis of public trust in government. The Watergate scandal, which began with a curious break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate complex, grew to symbolize deep ethical and constitutional issues in the executive branch. Soon, attention would shift to pressing global concerns, from an energy crisis at home to the mounting tensions and shifting allegiances of the Cold War abroad. Over the next 2 decades, successive presidential administrations grappled with these convergent challenges in different ways, culminating in the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 and the apparent resolution of a conflict that had shaped an entire era. Richard Nixon's 1972 re-election campaign was overshadowed by Watergate, though the justifiably famous break-in initially received limited public notice. The crisis deepened in 1973 when investigations revealed covert attempts by high-level officials to cover up their connections to the espionage. Key witnesses testified before the Senate Watergate Committee, unraveling a tapestry of illegal activities and deception that threatened the integrity of the White House. The release of the Nixon tapes, secret recordings of Oval Office conversations, ultimately cemented the president's complicity in obstructing justice. Faced with the likelihood of impeachment for abuse of power, contempt of Congress, and obstruction of justice, Nixon resigned on August 9, 1974. It was a historic moment. Never before had an American president left office in such a manner. Vice President Gerald Ford assumed the presidency, immediately granting Nixon a controversial pardon. This decision, Ford argued, aimed to spare the nation a prolonged trial and further division. But it also angered many Americans who felt Nixon should be held fully accountable under the law. Ford, who served the remainder of Nixon's term, struggled with the reputational damage to the presidency, an economic recession, and the final throes of the Vietnam conflict. In 1975, North Vietnam overtook the South, prompting images of helicopters lifting desperate evacuees from the U.S. Embassy roof in Saigon. Conflicts in Southeast Asia had ended for the United States, but not with the sense of victory or clarity that had characterized American interventions in earlier wars. Meanwhile, economic challenges, including high inflation combined with stagnating growth stagflation, cast a long shadow over Ford's time in office. Though he had hoped for a longer term to enact his vision, he lost to challenger Jimmy Carter, a Democrat and former Georgia governor, in the 1976 presidential election. Carter carefully campaigned on his identity as an outsider, reflecting widespread disillusionment with Washington politics. Taking office in 1977, Carter emphasized human rights as a cornerstone of his foreign policy. He also aimed to restore faith in government by promoting transparency and a more moral stance on international relations. Among his administration's triumphs was the Camp David Accords of 1978, a landmark agreement brokered between Egypt and Israel. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, both risking substantial political capital at home, negotiated a framework that led to the first peace treaty between Israel and an Arab state. Carter's tenacity made the signing possible, showcasing U.S. diplomatic influence in the Middle East. Nonetheless, other events chipped away at this foreign policy success. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 rekindled tensions between the superpowers. Carter, in response, imposed economic sanctions on the Soviet Union and orchestrated a U.S. boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics. Carter's most significant political crisis centered on Iran. For decades, the United States had supported the Shah of Iran, whose repressive regime clashed with growing Islamist and nationalist movements. In 1979, the Iranian Revolution toppled the Shah and replaced him with Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, establishing an Islamic republic ardently critical of Western powers. Later that year, Iranian students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took 52 Americans hostage. This crisis dragged on for 444 days, dominating press coverage and severely undermining Carter's presidency. A botched rescue attempt in the Iranian desert in April 1980 only deepened the administration's woes. Negotiations finally succeeded just as Carter was leaving office, but the hostages were not freed until minutes after Ronald Reagan was inaugurated on January 20th, 1981. To many Americans, the prolonged ordeal encapsulated the sense that the country's global standing and domestic unity had weakened. Reagan, a former Hollywood actor and governor of California, entered the White House with a message of renewed optimism, national pride, and a focus on cutting taxes and regulations to invigorate the economy, an approach labeled Reaganomics. At the heart of his domestic policy were supply-side economics, anchored by substantial tax cuts meant to stimulate private investment. Supporters credited this program with reducing inflation and revitalizing businesses, while critics argued it exacerbated public deficits and widened the gap between rich and poor. Meanwhile, Reagan denounced the Soviet Union in stark moral terms, famously calling it an evil empire, and embarked on a major buildup of military power. Initiatives like the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, nicknamed Star Wars, aimed to develop a space-based missile defense system that would shield the United States from nuclear attack. Despite the initial hawkish rhetoric, by Reagan's second term the relationship with the Soviet Union began to shift dramatically. Mikhail Gorbachev assumed power in 1985, instituting perestroika, economic restructuring, and glasnost, openness, reforms that sought to modernize the stagnant Soviet system and encourage freer public discussion. In a series of summits, Reagan and Gorbachev negotiated key arms reduction treaties, including the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, INF, treaty signed in 1987, which eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons. The image of Reagan delivering his iconic 1987 Berlin speech, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," became a symbol of the staunch American stance against Soviet control in Eastern Europe. Over the next few years, cracks in the Soviet bloc deepened. Popular movements in Poland, East Germany, Hungary, and elsewhere tested communist control. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, allowing free passage between East and West Berlin for the first time in decades, signaled the beginning of the end for Soviet satellites. Gorbachev's refusal to suppress these uprisings through force represented a stark departure from the iron-fisted policies of his predecessors. Meanwhile, on the domestic stage under Reagan, the 1980s saw a reinforcement of conservative social values. The war on drugs, spurred by heightened concerns about crack cocaine epidemics in major cities, led to aggressive federal policies and a significant rise in incarceration rates, especially among African Americans. Critics pointed out the racial disparities and violent aftermath of these policies, underscoring the enduring challenges of inequality, even as economic optimism dominated certain corners of society. The decade was also marked by the AIDS crisis. Initially dubbed a gay plague by some media outlets, HIV/AIDS quickly spread beyond any single demographic. Public health advocates battled both the disease and a wave of stigma, while the Reagan administration stood accused of a slow and underwhelming response. In 1988, Reagan's vice president, George H.W. Bush, won the presidency. While promising continuity with Reagan's policies, Bush faced a swiftly changing international environment. In 1989, a series of revolutions in Eastern Europe dismantled communist regimes in Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Romania. These peaceful revolutions, save for the violent overthrow of Nicolae Ceausescu in Romania, confirmed that the entire Eastern Bloc was disintegrating. World headlines swirled around the stunning images of Berliners dismantling the Berlin Wall, chunk by chunk, in a celebration of unity. As for the Soviet Union itself, its constituent republics, led by the examples of the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, began to assert independence. Gorbachev found himself in a precarious position, desperate to maintain the federation while continuing reforms. Economic conditions worsened, fueling discontent among the Soviet populace. Bush skillfully navigated the rapidly changing dynamics. In 1990, he partnered with Gorbachev to oversee the reunification of Germany as a single sovereign state, a move that would have been unimaginable just a few years prior. When Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in August 1990, Bush assembled a broad international coalition under United Nations approval to expel Iraqi forces, culminating in Operation Desert Storm in early 1991. The coalition's swift victory demonstrated America's formidable military might and the willingness of other nations to collaborate with Washington in maintaining post-Cold War stability. Yet, even as global events pivoted to the Persian Gulf, the Soviet Union appeared on the brink of collapse. An attempted coup by hardline communists in August 1991 badly discredited Gorbachev, and by December, the Soviet Union was formally dissolved. Independent states emerged in its place, with Russia at the forefront under Boris Yeltsin. Thus, the Cold War that had guided U.S. foreign policy and shaped domestic life since the end of World War II was effectively over. The long-held dread of nuclear confrontation began to recede, replaced by a sense that U.S. global preeminence might usher in a new era of international cooperation, or, as some called it optimistically, a new world order. Domestically, however, triumph on the global stage did not immediately resolve issues like budget deficits, healthcare accessibility, racial inequities, and questions about the proper scope of government. George H.W. Bush's presidency, highlighted by foreign policy successes, was followed by Bill Clinton's win in 1992, signaling yet another wave of change in the country's political tides. In retrospect, the period from Watergate to the fall of the Soviet Union demonstrated the resilience of the American constitutional system, alongside the influence, both constructive and destructive, of strong personalities in leadership. Staggering revelations about executive misconduct under Nixon prompted structural and political reforms. The War Powers Act of 1973 sought to limit presidential authority to commit troops without congressional consent, while new transparency measures aimed to restrain government secrecy. The Watergate years eroded public trust, but they also reinforced the idea that free media, Congress, and the judiciary could hold the highest office in the land accountable, preventing a slide into unchecked powers. Meanwhile, the collapse of the Soviet bloc and the Soviet Union itself brought mixed aftereffects. Advocates of free market capitalism saw this outcome as a validation of Western liberal democracy. Critics warned that unipolar power could tempt the United States to overreach or neglect domestic and international issues requiring nuanced, cooperative solutions. Indeed, at the dawn of the 1990s, national attention in the U.S. began to pivot from existential superpower rivalry to multinational, regional conflicts and economic globalization. In many ways, these decades represented a crucial pivot. The social transformations that had begun in the 1960s continued to expand, even under conservative administrations. Women attained further professional and political roles. Racial and ethnic communities pushed harder for equality and representation. The growing influence of media technology reshaped how Americans perceived both domestic authorities and distant foreign events. Likewise, the government became ever more deeply enmeshed in regulating economic and social life, from environmental protections to drug enforcement to educational standards. The conclusion of the Cold War cracked open a new world dynamic, in which the quest for democracy and free markets in Eastern Europe and elsewhere intersected with a surge in American confidence. The path from Watergate to 1991 thus traces a trajectory of disillusionment, recalibration, and, ultimately, renewed political possibility within a drastically altered global landscape. The dawn of 2021 found the United States at a crossroads similar in gravity to the transformations seen after past major crises, such as the Civil War, the Great Depression, and World War II. In each of those earlier eras, Americans debated the extent of federal intervention in everyday life, the boundaries of civil liberties, and the balance of power between competing political ideologies. Now, against the backdrop of the still unfolding COVID-19 pandemic and a polarized electorate, the country embarked on a new chapter as President Joe Biden took office on January 20th, 2021. Just as Reconstruction-era leaders struggled to unify a nation torn by secession, the Biden administration faced the challenge of uniting a politically fractured public, addressing pandemic fallout, and promoting an economic recovery reminiscent of the ambitious federal programs seen in Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal and Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society. From the earliest days of his administration, Biden confronted a crisis akin to the social and economic disruptions that followed the stock market crash of 1929 or major wartime mobilizations. Millions of Americans have been infected by COVID-19, hundreds of thousands had died. Vaccination campaigns, building on Operation Warp Speed, gained momentum in early 2021, raising hopes of replicating the post-World War II sense of renewal as Americans anticipated a return to normalcy. Stimulus measures echoed past government interventions aimed at revitalizing the economy and supporting families. The American Rescue Plan, signed in March 2021, infused $1.9 trillion into direct stimulus payments, enhanced unemployment benefits, and expanded child tax credits, recalling New Deal-style efforts to shield households from the harshest economic shocks. Despite significant progress in vaccination rates by late spring, pockets of resistance and the emergence of new variants underscored the persistent public health challenges. Tensions over federal mandates and mass policies mirrored earlier clashes between states' rights advocates and champions of centralized action, an echo of debates dating back to the Constitution's ratification. By mid-2021, discussions shifted from crisis control to deeper questions of health equity and how to rebuild in a way that might mitigate long-standing inequalities. Workplaces reopened, but parents and educators grappled with how to run schools safely. The Biden administration's emphasis on following the science became a political lightning rod, reflecting again the historical reality that U.S. society has often debated federal authority, from the Alien and Sedition Acts in the late 18th century to the regulatory expansions of the Progressive Era. Throughout 2021 and early 2022, Biden's team attempted to move forward on a broad agenda reminiscent of earlier pushes to shape the nation's infrastructure and social fabric. In November 2021, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, passed with bipartisan support, summoned memories of the 19th century railroad boom and the New Deal's ambitious public works. Upgrading roads, bridges, ports, and broadband networks modernized infrastructure as dramatically as the transcontinental railroads had once knit together the post-Civil War nation. However, other priorities encountered obstacles, recalling many past tensions between progressive ambitions and conservative opposition. The Build Back Better proposal, which targeted childcare subsidies and climate incentives, stalled in the Senate. Debates over voting rights intensified, echoing both the post-Reconstruction era struggles over suffrage and the more recent civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. With a 6-3 conservative majority on the Supreme Court secured after the 2020 appointment of Amy Coney Barrett, many states took advantage of the legal environment to pass restrictive voting laws, an evolution of historically fraught battles over ballot access dating back to Jim Crow and beyond. By the 2022 midterms, partisan divides had hardened, shaped by polarizing cultural issues and the economic challenge of rising inflation. Supply chain disruptions and high consumer demand placed everyday expenses at the forefront of voter concerns, reminiscent of the stagflation crises of the 1970s that rattled middle-class confidence and fueled political realignments. While the Democratic Party maintained a razor-thin Senate majority, Republicans captured the House of Representatives, heralding a return to divided government for 2023. Like previous eras of partisan conflict, from the Gilded Age through the New Deal coalition, heightened fiscal debates ensued over entitlement spending, taxes, and the scope of government intervention. Newly empowered House Republicans pushed for spending cuts, while Democrats defended social programs in a throwback to earlier battles over welfare, Social Security, and the role of federal authority. Narrowly avoiding a federal shutdown in late 2023, the government once again demonstrated both the resilience and the fragility of modern democracy, a cycle that has repeated since the first major budget confrontations in the 19th century, and especially since the polarized budget showdowns of the late 20th century. Internationally, the Biden administration worked to reassert U.S. alliances, a challenge that recalled the early Cold War period wherein leaders sought to form strong international partnerships like NATO. Recommitting to transatlantic ties, Biden hosted multiple summits among democratic nations, focusing particularly on rising tensions with China, just as mid-20th century leaders faced off with the Soviet Union. Issues surrounding Taiwan, cybersecurity, and trade policy provoked friction between Washington and Beijing, sometimes leading to confrontations that evoked the brinkmanship of the Cold War era. In Europe, volatile energy markets raised concern, echoing the oil crises of the 1970s, while the Middle East's shifting power balances mirrored the sometimes quiet, sometimes flaring hotspots that defined U.S. foreign policy after World War II. The American military, having drawn down in Afghanistan and Iraq, scaled back its footprint, but controversies over humanitarian crises, terrorism, and arms deals endured. In this respect, foreign policy under Biden reflected both continuity and change, blending lessons from the War on Terror with long-standing concerns over the global order. Several pivotal Supreme Court rulings in 2022 showcased how the court's composition can redirect the policy conversation, just as past major rulings from Dred Scott on the eve of the Civil War to Brown versus Board of Education during the Civil Rights era had reshaped national debates. In particular, the court's decision in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization overturned Roe versus Wade, igniting fierce debates over reproductive rights. This return of abortion laws to the states paralleled earlier eras where local legislation carried great weight, despite a backdrop of national moral arguments dating to the early republic's debates on states' rights. Simultaneously, Republicans in some states pushed to regulate how race, sexuality, and gender identity were taught, policies that recalled the culture wars over evolution, sex education, and civil rights curricula throughout the 20th century. These controversies played a major role in shaping the 2024 presidential campaigns, signaling how educational battles, much like past controversies over school segregation or Scopes trial debates, continue to serve as flashpoints in American political life. By early 2023, Donald Trump's reemergence as a potential candidate for the Republican presidential nomination underscored the cyclical nature of American politics. From Grover Cleveland's non-consecutive terms in the late 19th century to Theodore Roosevelt's attempt at a third term through the Bull Moose Party, U.S. history has witnessed dramatic political comebacks. In this case, Trump overcame multiple investigations tied to events like the January 6 Capitol riot, maintaining a firm grip on segments of the Republican base. Key GOP figures vied for the nomination, but ultimately Trump's ability to dominate media coverage and rally supporters proved decisive. On the Democratic side, Vice President Kamala Harris became the nominee after Biden opted not to run again, bearing the standard for an administration that had shepherded the nation out of the worst of the pandemic but faced persistent polarization. Harris's campaign invoked continuity with Biden's policies, pointing to infrastructure improvements and COVID-19 relief successes as proof of government's capacity to address national challenges, a theme stretching as far back as Alexander Hamilton's Federalist arguments for a robust federal system. When Americans went to the polls in November 2024, turnout rivaled the record levels of 2020, reinforcing a trend of heightened political engagement reminiscent of the 19th century elections that drew massive crowds and fierce partisanship. Battlegrounds formed around states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Georgia, Arizona, Michigan, and Nevada, echoing electoral standoffs that have shaped presidential outcomes since the founding era's contested votes in early competitive elections. The final results showed another razor-thin contest, with Trump securing around 312 electoral votes to Harris's 226. Analysts cited lingering inflation, energy controversies, and cultural wedge issues as motivating Trump's base to recapture states he lost in 2020. Major news outlets, including NBC News, AP, and the New York Times, confirmed Trump's victory the following day. Vice President Harris, much like past candidates facing close defeats, conceded and reaffirmed her commitment to core Democratic ideals. This outcome mirrored cyclical patterns in American history, where a wave of reform or progressive policymaking is sometimes followed by a swing toward more conservative leadership. Donald J. Trump retook the presidential oath on January 20th, 2025, marking a rare non-consecutive second term in U.S. history. The ceremony, heavy with partisan tension, underscored election themes of economic nationalism, calls for deregulation, curbing immigration, and reasserting an America First stance in global affairs. For those who remember the expansions of healthcare under the Affordable Care Act or environmental policies amplified in earlier decades, Trump's inaugural signals offered a sharp policy contrast, again illustrating how quickly the nation's political winds can shift. Moderate Republican margins in both the House and Senate shaped Trump's second term, echoing the sort of legislative push and pull observed many times before. Reconstruction-era Republicans enjoyed majorities that shaped civil liberties. Progressive-era lawmakers tackled labor and antitrust reforms, and the New Deal Congress passed sweeping social legislation. Now, a rejuvenated conservative caucus looked to pass or reintroduce laws favoring reduced regulation, stricter immigration policies, and conservative judicial appointments. Hindsight reveals that the period spanning 2021 to 2025 epitomized American democracy's capacity for abrupt shifts. Just as Reconstruction gave way to the Gilded Age and the 1960s liberal policies gave way to the Reagan Revolution of the 1980s, President Biden's initial wave of federally guided crisis management, while partially successful, provoked strong countermovements. Economic disruptions reminiscent of the late 19th century fueled inflation anxiety. Cultural debates over education and reproductive rights echoed the tumult of the 1960s and 1970s, and global realignments called to mind the anxious pivot points of the Cold War era. The 2022 midterms rearranged congressional power, signaling resistance to expansive federal spending and intensifying disputes over civil rights and state authority. Long-standing historical themes that have shaped the country since its founding. By 2024, the Republican Party united behind Donald Trump, whose appeal to conservative voters on issues like immigration, energy production, and traditional social values evoked populist urges that have appeared repeatedly in U.S. history, from Andrew Jackson's presidency through the Tea Party movement. For future historians, this era will stand as a window on both the endurance of American democracy. Power was transferred, albeit contentiously, and the profound challenges of bridging deep cultural, economic, and ideological divides. The story continued with another Trump administration poised to reshape policy from the courts to foreign deals, further testing the adaptability of a republic long defined by its dynamic mix of continuity and change. As the nation grappled with new technologies, demographic shifts, and global economic transformations, the United States remained consistent with its historical roots, perpetually in debate about the meaning of liberty, the boundaries of governance, and the pursuit of a more perfect union.